Judge Harold Monroe sat frozen in his chair, his face pale, his fingers gripping the wooden gavel like a lifeline. The courtroom was silent, so silent that even the faintest breath could be heard. Every eye in the room was locked onto one man standing at the defendant's table, his hands cuffed in front of him, his lips curled into a wicked grin. It was Damian Knox, a man with a history of brutal crimes, a man whose very name sent chills down the spines of the bravest law enforcers. And now, after being sentenced to life in prison, he had spoken the words that turned the air in the room ice cold. "When I get out of this hellhole," Damian growled, his voice dripping with venom, "I'm coming for you, Judge. You hear me? You think this wooden hammer can protect you forever? You think these bars will hold me? No. The moment I step out, you're dead." The room erupted. Gasps filled the space. The guards rushed toward Damian, gripping his arms tightly as he cackled like a madman. Judge Monroe remained still, staring at the man who had just promised him death. And then, to everyone's shock, the judge did something no one expected. He leaned forward, eyes locked with Damian's, and with an eerily calm voice he said, "Then I guess I'll be seeing you soon." 6 months earlier, the nightmare had begun. Judge Harold Monroe was known for his strong sense of justice. He had sent countless criminals to prison without hesitation. But when the case of Damian Knox landed on his desk, he knew this trial would be different. Damian was a ruthless killer, a mastermind. He had orchestrated a series of robberies, leaving behind a trail of bodies. The police had struggled to catch him, but when they finally did, they had more than enough evidence to put him away for life. The trial had been intense. The courtroom was packed every single day, the media swarming the courthouse. Witnesses came forward, telling horrifying stories of what Damian had done. He laughed. One witness sobbed. "After he killed my brother," he laughed. But despite the mountain of evidence, Damian never once looked nervous. He sat there, day after day, wearing that same smug grin. It was as if he knew something no one else did. Then came the final day of the trial, the day of sentencing. Judge Monroe had never been a man to second-guess himself, but as he prepared to deliver his verdict, he felt something deep in his gut. Something wasn't right. Damian was too calm, too confident. And then, just as he delivered the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Damian had leaned in, his eyes burning with something terrifying. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Judge." Monroe dismissed it as the words of a desperate man. Until the threats started. It began with letters, slipped under his office door, left on his car, even mailed to his house. Messages scribbled in red ink. "You can't lock the devil away forever. I always finish what I start." Then, things escalated. His dog was found poisoned in his backyard. His house was broken into, nothing was stolen, but a single note was left behind. Counting down the days, security was increased. Police patrolled his home, but nothing could erase the feeling that Damian was still watching. And then, the moment in the courtroom happened. The moment Damian made his threat in front of everyone. Judge Monroe had spent his life putting criminals behind bars. But now, for the first time, he felt something different. Fear. Yet, he refused to show it. That night, after the trial ended, Monroe sat in his study, replaying Damian's words in his head. "You're dead." The judge had faced dangerous men before, but none like Damian. Then crash. The sound of shattering glass. Monroe shot to his feet. His heart pounded. He reached for the gun in his desk drawer, his hands shaking as he moved toward the noise. His house had the best security money could buy. Cameras. Alarm systems. But in that moment, he felt completely vulnerable. He stepped into his living room, scanning the darkness. And then, a shadow moved. Someone was inside his house. And they weren't alone. Judge Harold Monroe's grip tightened around the gun in his hand. His breath was shallow, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. The broken glass glistened on the floor under the dim moonlight streaming through the shattered window. Someone was inside his house. And they weren't alone. Monroe swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had expected retaliation for sentencing Damian Knox to life, but not this soon. Not this bold. He moved slowly, his bare feet barely making a sound on the cold wooden floor. The silence in the house was suffocating. Then, movement. A shadow shifted near the staircase. Monroe raised his gun. "Show yourself," he commanded, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. Nothing. Then bang. A loud crash came from the kitchen. Monroe spun around, aiming his gun toward the sound. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he stood his ground. He had faced criminals before. He wasn't about to let fear control him. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Someone was walking toward him. Monroe inhaled sharply and turned the corner, gun raised. His finger was steady on the trigger. And then, a masked man lunged at him. Monroe fired. The gunshot echoed through the house. The figure staggered back, but he didn't fall. The judge barely had time to react before another shadow appeared from the hallway. Two of them. Adrenaline surged through Monroe's body as he realized this wasn't just a break-in. This was an attack. One of the men charged at him. Monroe fired again, but the attacker tackled him before he could aim properly. They crashed onto the floor, the gun skidding across the tiles. Monroe struggled, but the man was strong. A gloved hand clamped around his throat, squeezing. His vision blurred. He thrashed wildly, kicking, clawing. Then bang. Another gunshot. The pressure on his throat released as the man groaned in pain. Monroe gasped for air, coughing as he pushed the attacker off him. He scrambled for his gun just as the second man fled through the shattered window, disappearing into the night. The judge aimed at the man still on the floor, clutching his bleeding arm. "Who sent you?" Monroe demanded, his voice hoarse. The masked man groaned, struggling to sit up. Blood dripped onto the floor. Monroe took a step closer, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I said, who sent you?" The man chuckled, a low, raspy sound that made Monroe's blood run cold. "You already know," he whispered. Monroe's heart pounded. Damien. The name burned in his mind. He had only been sentenced today. How could he already have men on the outside working for him? The injured man let out another weak laugh before slumping to the floor, unconscious. Monroe didn't wait. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911. His hands were shaking. This was no ordinary criminal. Damien Knox had power, inside and outside prison walls. And he had just declared war. The police arrived within minutes. The crime scene was chaotic. Officers swarmed the house, taking photos, gathering evidence, questioning Monroe. The injured intruder was taken away in an ambulance under police custody. Detective Cole Harrison, a hardened officer with 20 years on the force, stood with Monroe outside the house. "This was planned," Harrison said, his voice grim. "They weren't here to rob you. They were here to send a message." Monroe ran a hand over his face. "And the message is clear. Damien Knox isn't finished with me." Harrison sighed. "We're putting you under protection, Judge. You need security. This guy, he's dangerous." Monroe exhaled sharply. "I don't need security. I need to know how a man behind bars can still pull strings on the outside." The detective hesitated before saying, "I don't know how, but I'll find out. Until then, you need to be careful." This was just the beginning. Monroe didn't respond. He already knew that. Because Damien Knox wasn't just another criminal. He was a predator. And he had just marked his prey. The next day, Monroe tried to return to normal. He went to work, reviewed cases, tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. But everyone at the courthouse had heard what happened. The looks, the whispers. Even his colleagues were nervous. "You should take a break, Harold," Judge Evelyn Carter told him over lunch. "Go somewhere safe until things settle down." Monroe shook his head. "I won't run from this," Carter sighed. "You're brave, but you're not invincible." He knew she was right. But what choice did he have? Running would only make Damien bolder. So he stayed. That night, Monroe returned home. The broken window had been replaced. Security cameras were installed. Police cars patrolled his street. But none of it made him feel safer. Because when he stepped inside his house, he saw something that made his blood turn to ice. A note, sitting on his coffee table. No sign of forced entry. No broken doors. No alarms triggered. Just a single, folded note, with 3 words written in blood-red ink. "You can't hide. Judge Harold Monroe's breath hitched as he stared at the note. You can't hide. The words burned into his mind like a brand. The ink was red, too thick, too dark. Was it just ink? Or was it something worse? He swallowed, his pulse pounding in his ears. His house had been secured, patrolled, guarded. And yet, someone had been inside. Someone had left him a message. His grip on his gun tightened as he scanned the room. The air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. He checked the locks. They were intact. The windows? Secure. The security footage? Shakily, he pulled out his phone and opened the security app connected to his new cameras. He scrolled through the footage, rewinding to earlier in the day. And then, he saw it. The feed flickered. Then it went black. 5 whole minutes of nothing. Monroe's stomach clenched. They had cut the cameras. They had known exactly how to get in and out without a trace. He was dealing with professionals. His first instinct was to call the police. But then, he hesitated. This was Damien. This was exactly what he wanted. To watch Monroe panic. To make him feel powerless. And he had to admit, he did feel powerless. But not for long. Monroe snatched up the note, stormed into his office, and pulled open the locked drawer of his desk. Inside, under stacks of legal documents, lay a folder. Thick. Confidential. Everything he had on Damien Knox. If Damien thought he could play games, Monroe would make sure he played back. And this time, he wouldn't be caught off guard. The next morning, Monroe sat in his car outside the prison. Folsom State Penitentiary. The place where Damien Knox had been locked away just 3 days ago. But locked away didn't mean powerless. Monroe knew that now. He had spent all night reading through Damien's case files again, searching for names, patterns, anything that could explain how he still had men working for him. One name had stood out. Marco Salazar, a convicted arms dealer. The man Damien had done business with before his arrest. A man rumored to have contacts inside and outside prison walls. If Monroe wanted answers, he would start with him. He stepped out of his car and approached the front gate, flashing his credentials. The guards led him through the maze of steel and concrete until he reached a small, dimly lit interrogation room. A few minutes later, the door creaked open. Marco Salazar strolled in, a wiry man with a sharp face and a smirk that never quite reached his eyes. He sat down across from Monroe, cuffed hands resting on the table. Judge Monroe, he drawled. What an honor. Monroe didn't waste time. How is Damien Knox still running things from behind bars? Salazar chuckled. Straight to the point. I like that. He leaned back in his chair. But here's the thing, Judge. I don't answer questions for free. Monroe narrowed his eyes. And what do you want? Salazar's smirk widened. A favor. If I give you what you need. Someday, when the time is right, I'll call in a favor of my own. Monroe hesitated. A deal with a criminal? Everything inside him screamed against it. But then he remembered the note. The break-in. The attack. He wasn't dealing with a normal case. He was dealing with a monster. Finally, he nodded. Fine. Tell me what you know. Salazar grinned. Damien's not just some thug. He's got reach. Connections. And the reason you're in trouble? It's because you made a mistake. Monroe's jaw clenched. What mistake? You didn't just sentence him, Salazar said, his voice lowering. You humiliated him. Publicly. You stared him down in that courtroom and let the whole world see that you weren't afraid. He leaned in, eyes gleaming. But a man like Damien? He feeds off fear. And when you didn't give him any, he decided to take it from you instead. Monroe felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. This wasn't about justice. This wasn't about revenge. This was personal. Salazar's voice dropped even lower. He's got cops in his pocket, Judge. Guards. Inmates. He's been planning this for months. And trust me, this is just the beginning. Monroe's fingers tightened into fists. Damien had his claws in the system. That explained how he was still orchestrating attacks from inside. But if he thought Monroe would back down, he was wrong. The judge stood up. Thanks for the warning. But if you think I'm going to run, you're dead wrong. Salazar laughed. Oh, I don't think you'll run. He cocked his head. But I do think you should hurry home. Monroe froze. Why? Salazar's grin widened. Because while you've been sitting here talking to me, he tapped his fingers on the table. They've been paying your house another visit. Monroe's blood ran cold. He spun on his heel and stormed out of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He barely heard the guards calling after him as he sprinted to his car, yanked the door open, and tore out of the parking lot. He didn't care about speed limits, didn't care about traffic. His mind was filled with one thought. Was he too late? His tires screeched as he pulled into his street. He barely threw the car into park before jumping out. His house. The front door was wide open. The lights inside flickered. Monroe's stomach dropped. He reached for his gun, every nerve in his body on high alert. He stepped inside and stopped cold. The house was wrecked, furniture overturned, papers scattered. The scent of something metallic, blood, lingered in the air. And then he saw it, on the wall, smeared in red. A message, "See you soon, Judge," and just below it, a single playing card pinned to the wall with a knife. The King of Spades, Damien's signature. Monroe's fingers clenched around his gun. This wasn't just a warning. This was war. Judge Harold Monroe stood frozen, his breath shallow as he stared at the blood-red message smeared across his wall. "See you soon, Judge." The words sent an eerie chill down his spine, but it was the playing card beneath it, the King of Spades, that made his stomach twist. Damien's calling card. A signature he left for those he wanted to break before destroying them. Monroe's grip tightened around his gun as his pulse hammered in his ears. His house had been torn apart, ransacked like a storm had passed through it. Drawers had been pulled from their cabinets. Bookshelves tipped over. His personal files scattered across the floor. They weren't just sending a message. They were looking for something. And they had been inside his house again. A sharp creak echoed through the hallway. Monroe's muscles tensed. He wasn't alone. He turned swiftly, raising his gun toward the dark corridor. His heartbeat throbbed in his ears as he moved cautiously forward. The house was eerily quiet now, as if holding its breath. Then, footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. Someone was still here. Monroe's mind raced. If they were waiting for him, why hadn't they attacked yet? Were they toying with him? Another step. Closer. Monroe pressed his back against the wall, his hands steady on the gun. He inhaled deeply, counted to 3, and swung around the corner, gun raised. But the moment he did, a figure lunged at him from the shadows. Monroe pulled the trigger. Bang! The shot echoed through the house. The figure staggered, but before Monroe could react, something heavy slammed into his arm. The gun was knocked from his grasp, skidding across the floor. Monroe barely had time to react before a fist crashed into his ribs. The air was knocked from his lungs as he stumbled back, pain searing through his side. His attacker was fast. Monroe swung wildly, landing a solid punch to the man's jaw, but it barely slowed him. Then, out of nowhere, a blade flashed in the dim light. Monroe barely dodged as the knife slashed past his face, missing by inches. He had no time to think, no time to react. His attacker came at him again, relentless. Monroe grabbed the nearest object, a heavy brass lamp, and swung it with all his strength. Crack! The lamp smashed into the intruder's head. The man stumbled, groaning as he dropped to one knee. Monroe didn't hesitate. He grabbed the man by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "Who sent you?" he roared, his breath ragged. The man coughed, blood dripping from his lip. He laughed, a dark, sickening chuckle that made Monroe's skin crawl. "You already know," the man rasped. Monroe's blood boiled. He shoved the man harder against the wall. "Where's Damien getting his orders out from?" The man smirked. "He doesn't need to be outside to get what he wants." Monroe's eyes narrowed. "That's not an answer." But the man only smiled wider, his teeth red with blood. "He's been watching you for months, Judge. He knows how you think, how you move. And he's not going to stop." Monroe's fingers clenched into fists. He wanted to break this man apart, to force the truth from him. But before he could, the attacker's head slumped forward. Unconscious. Monroe released a breath. He had been lucky this time. Too lucky. But Damien was getting bolder. And Monroe knew he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to strike first. 15 minutes later, The police had arrived. Officers swarmed his house, inspecting the damage, taking statements. Detective Cole Harrison paced the living room, his face dark with frustration. "This is getting out of hand," Harrison muttered. "You need protection, Judge. You can't keep going up against these guys alone." Monroe shook his head. "Protection won't stop this. Damien has men everywhere. I need to cut off his power." Harrison sighed. "And how do you plan on doing that?" Monroe's jaw tightened. "By going after the people still helping him inside the prison." Harrison frowned. "You're talking about the guards? The corrupt ones?" Monroe nodded. "Someone is letting his orders slip through. Someone is passing messages, smuggling in phones, giving him access to the outside world. If I can find that person—" "You'll be painting a target even bigger on your back," Harrison interrupted. "If you expose his inside contacts, Damien won't just be playing games anymore. He'll be coming at you with everything he's got." Monroe met his gaze firmly. "Then I'll be ready." Harrison exhaled sharply. He knew there was no talking Monroe out of this. After a long pause, he said, "I might have a lead." Monroe's ears perked up. "What kind of lead?" Harrison glanced around, lowering his voice. "One of our undercover informants inside Folsom just got word that there's a specific guard making late-night visits to Damien's cell. Whispers of payments being exchanged." Monroe's grip on his coffee cup tightened. "Who?" Harrison hesitated. Then, finally, he said, "Officer Reed Donovan." Monroe's breath hitched. He knew that name. Reed Donovan was a long-time prison officer. Respected, clean, untouchable. Or so everyone thought. Monroe's mind raced. If Donovan was on Damien's payroll, that meant Damien had direct access to everything inside the prison. And that was how he was still pulling the strings. "Where can I find him?" Monroe asked. Harrison exhaled, rubbing his temple. "You're not going to like it." Monroe stared at him. "Tell me." Harrison sighed. "Right now? He's on duty. At Folsom." Monroe's jaw clenched. He knew what that meant. If he wanted answers, he would have to go back inside the prison. And this time, Damien would be expecting him. Judge Harold Monroe sat in his car outside Folsom State Penitentiary, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. This was reckless. Insane. But he didn't have a choice. Damien Knox had men on the outside. He had men on the inside. And now, Monroe was about to walk straight into his territory. The prison was supposed to be his cage. But right now, it felt like a trap. Monroe exhaled sharply and pushed open the door. His mind was sharp, but his body was tense as he stepped out. Walking into that prison felt different this time. Last time, he was the one in control, the judge, the man who decided fates. But now, he was walking straight into the lion's den. The moment Monroe stepped through the metal detectors, he felt it. Eyes on him. Prison guards nodded stiffly as he passed. Some looked away. Others whispered into their radios. Monroe wasn't stupid. They all knew why he was here. And if Damien had a rat among them, that rat knew too. A tall, muscular guard with graying hair and tired eyes approached him. Warden Glenn Harper. "Judge Monroe," Harper said, shaking his hand. "I heard about what happened at your house." Monroe studied him. He was one of the few men he trusted here. But trust was a fragile thing these days. "That's why I'm here," Monroe said bluntly. "I need to talk to Officer Reed Donovan." Harper's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's a dangerous move." Monroe arched an eyebrow. "So is letting Damien Knox run this place from his cell?" The warden sighed. "Come with me." The interrogation room was cold and sterile, with fluorescent lights flickering above. Monroe sat at the steel table, waiting. His fingers tapped the surface rhythmically, his mind calculating every possible move. Then, the door opened. Officer Reed Donovan stepped inside. He looked just as Monroe remembered, clean-shaven, sharp uniform, the face of a model correctional officer. But Monroe wasn't fooled. This man was dirty, and he was about to find out just how dirty. Donovan sat down, his expression blank. "I wasn't expecting a meeting with you, Judge." Monroe didn't waste time. "You've been visiting Damien Knox at odd hours, taking private meetings, looking the other way when his orders leave this prison." Donovan blinked. "Is that an accusation?" Monroe leaned forward. "It's a fact." For a split second, something flickered in Donovan's eyes. But it was gone just as fast. "I don't know what you're talking about," Donovan said smoothly. Monroe pulled a small recorder from his pocket and pressed play. A distorted voice crackled to life. "The judge thinks he's safe. He's not. You'll get the next message to him soon." It was faint, but the voice belonged to Donovan. The color drained from the officer's face. Monroe smiled. "Got you. You're done lying," Monroe said. "I have more recordings. I know you've been working for Damien. I know you've been helping him run his operations. And I know you're the reason he still has power." Donovan's jaw clenched. "I don't have to listen to this." He stood up. Monroe's voice was sharp. "Sit down." Donovan hesitated, then slowly lowered himself back into his chair. Monroe exhaled. "I don't care how deep you're in. You're going to tell me everything, or I'll make sure you share a cell with Damien for the rest of your life." For the first time, Donovan looked rattled. He ran a hand over his face, shaking his head. Then, finally, he spoke. "You don't understand," Donovan said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't have a choice." Monroe narrowed his eyes. "Everyone has a choice." Donovan swallowed hard. "Not with Damien." The story Donovan told made Monroe's stomach turn. It had started small. A favor here, a blind eye there. Then, it became threats. Then, money. Then, more threats. By the time Donovan realized how deep he was in, it was too late. "He doesn't just have guards in his pocket," Donovan whispered. "He has judges, cops, politicians, people way higher than me." Monroe's blood went cold. Judges. That meant Damien's reach was even wider than he thought. "He won't stop," Donovan continued, his voice shaking. "And if you think your house getting trashed was the worst of it—" He stopped suddenly. Monroe leaned forward. "What?" Donovan's lips parted, his eyes darting to the door. He looked like a man on the verge of breaking. "They're planning something. Something big." Monroe's pulse spiked. "What is Damien planning?" Donovan's breathing quickened. "He doesn't just want to scare you." Monroe's stomach twisted. He already knew that. "He wants you dead." The words sent a chill through Monroe's body. But before he could press further, boom! A loud explosion rocked the building. The walls trembled. Alarms blared. Monroe shot to his feet. What the hell was that? Donovan's eyes widened in horror. "It's starting." Before Monroe could react, the prison door burst open. A guard ran in, his face pale. "Warden, we've got a riot breaking out, and Damien's cell is empty." Monroe's blood ran cold. Damien Knox, the man who had just threatened his life, had disappeared. The alarms wailed through Folsom State Penitentiary, the sound piercing through the chaos like a siren of doom. Judge Harold Monroe stood frozen, the words echoing in his mind. Damien's cell is empty. It wasn't possible. It shouldn't have been possible. But here it was, happening right in front of him. "Lock down the facility." Warden Harper barked orders to the panicked guards. No one in or out. But Monroe knew. It was already too late. Damien Knox wasn't just escaping. This had been planned. The explosion, the riot, the distraction. It wasn't just a lucky break. It was a carefully orchestrated escape. Monroe's heart pounded. The prison was descending into madness. Inmates flooding the halls, guards struggling to regain control. He turned to Officer Reed Donovan. The man was shaking, his face drained of color. "You knew about this," Monroe hissed. "Didn't you?" Donovan swallowed hard. I didn't know when," he stammered. "But he told me. He told me it was coming." Monroe clenched his fists. He didn't have time to argue. He had one mission now. Find Damien, before he disappeared forever. Monroe pushed his way through the chaos, dodging inmates who were either fighting, escaping, or both. He needed to get to the surveillance room. If Damien had been spotted on the cameras, that was his best shot at tracking him down. But the moment he reached the security corridor, a group of rioting inmates blocked his path. One of them, a towering man with a jagged scar down his cheek, grinned at Monroe, cracking his knuckles. Well, the man sneered. "Look what we have here. A judge." Monroe's stomach twisted. He recognized him. Terrence Cole, sentenced to 30 years for multiple counts of assault. And Monroe was the one who put him behind bars. The man's eyes burned with hatred. You sentenced me to rot in here, Cole growled. Looks like it's your turn now. The inmates closed in. Monroe's pulse pounded. Then, a gunshot. The bullet struck the wall beside Cole's head, sending shards of concrete flying. The inmates froze. And from behind them, Detective Cole Harrison stepped forward, gun raised. His face was grim. Get away from him, he ordered. The inmates hesitated, but Harrison didn't. Bang! Another warning shot into the ceiling. That was enough. The rioters scattered, disappearing into the prison chaos. Monroe exhaled, his hands still clenched into fists. What the hell are you doing here? Harrison lowered his gun. Came to check on you. He gave Monroe a hard look. Good thing I did. Monroe didn't argue. We need to get to the surveillance room. Now. Harrison nodded. Then let's move. They reached the security office within minutes. Guards were scrambling, shouting at monitors, trying to regain control. But Monroe only had eyes for one screen. Where's Damien? He demanded. One of the guards frantically clicked through the cameras. He was last seen heading toward the West Wing, the guard said. But then, he paused. The screen flickered, then cut to black. Monroe's stomach dropped. What happened? The guard's face paled. Someone disabled the cameras in that section. Monroe turned to Harrison. That's where the staff exit is, right? Harrison's expression hardened. Yeah. Monroe clenched his jaw. Damien was heading for the exit, and if he got out, he would disappear. Monroe and Harrison ran. The prison halls were still in chaos. Sirens blared, shouts echoed, guards wrestled inmates to the ground. But Monroe didn't stop. They had to reach the West Wing before Damien did. As they turned the corner, a shot rang out. Monroe and Harrison ducked behind cover. A gunman stood at the far end of the hall, one of Damien's men, disguised as a guard. Cover me, Harrison whispered. Monroe nodded. Harrison leaned out, firing 3 precise shots. The fake guard stumbled, collapsing to the ground. Monroe didn't wait. They rushed forward. And then, Monroe saw it. The West Wing exit door. Slightly open. His heart pounded. Damien had gone through. He shoved the door open and froze. Damien Knox stood just outside, under the cover of darkness, waiting. A helicopter's blades whirred overhead. An escaped chopper. Damien turned, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Monroe. And then, he smirked. Monroe raised his gun. It's over, Damien. Damien's smile didn't waver. No, Judge. It's just beginning. Then, the helicopter's door slid open, and gunfire erupted. Monroe dove for cover as bullets tore through the concrete. When he looked back, Damien was already climbing into the chopper. No. Monroe surged forward, firing his gun. Bang, bang. One of his bullets clipped Damien's shoulder. The criminal staggered, but it wasn't enough. The helicopter lifted off. Damien was getting away. Monroe stood there, breathing heavily, watching as the man who had sworn to kill him disappeared into the night sky. He had failed. Damien Knox was free. And now, the real hunt began. The roar of the helicopter faded into the distance, swallowed by the darkness. Judge Harold Monroe stood motionless, his gun still raised, his breath sharp and ragged. Damien Knox had escaped. He had been right there. Monroe had been seconds away from stopping him, and now he was gone. A sickening frustration boiled inside him, but before he could process it, Harrison grabbed his arm. We need to go. Now. Monroe turned, eyes still locked on the sky. I had him. We'll get another shot, Harrison snapped. But if we don't move, we might not make it out of here alive. Reality crashed down on Monroe like a freight train. The prison was still in chaos. The riot hadn't stopped. If anything, it was getting worse. Gunshots rang out. Inmates screamed. Smoke curled through the air from small fires that had started in different sections of the building. Harrison was right. They weren't safe here. Monroe shoved his frustration deep down and followed Harrison back inside. For now, the priority was survival. They moved quickly through the halls, navigating the mayhem. Guards were still struggling to contain the prisoners, but Monroe could tell they were losing. A group of inmates spotted them from across the corridor. There, one of them shouted. That's the judge. Monroe barely had time to react before they rushed him. Harrison shoved him aside and fired. Bang! Bang! One inmate collapsed, screaming. The others hesitated. Back off, Harrison warned, his gun steady. Or I drop the next one. The prisoners exchanged glances. Then, without another word, they turned and ran. Monroe exhaled, his body tense. They had recognized him, and that meant one thing. Damien had spread the word. They finally reached the staff exit, stepping into the cool night air. Police sirens wailed in the distance as SWAT vans barreled through the prison gates. Reinforcements had arrived. But it was too late. Monroe stared at the sky, his fists clenched. Damien was out there now, and he had unfinished business. 2 hours later, Monroe sat in the back of an unmarked police car, his mind running through the same thought over and over. Where would Damien go? He had planned the escape too perfectly. The helicopter had been waiting. The riot had been timed down to the second. And then, a sick realization hit him. He had help, and not just from prison guards. Damien had people on the outside. People powerful enough to arrange for an escape right under the authorities' noses. Monroe needed answers, and he needed them fast. By the time they reached the precinct, the entire city was on high alert. Damien Knox's escape was all over the news. Monroe stepped into the station, his face grim. There was only one person who might have some answers. Reed Donovan. The corrupt prison guard was sitting in an interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the table, a cup of water untouched in front of him. Monroe stepped inside. Donovan glanced up, his face pale. "You look like hell," he muttered. Monroe ignored him. Where would Damien go? Donovan scoffed. "You think I know?" "I think you knew about the escape," Monroe shot back. "And I think you were smart enough to keep some of the details to yourself." Donovan didn't answer. Monroe leaned in. His voice was quiet. "Dangerous. You think Damien's going to let you live?" he asked. "You failed him. You're expendable." Donovan's face twitched. "He's out now," Monroe continued. "And when he's done with me, he's coming for you." Silence. Then, a slow, shaking breath. Donovan licked his lips. "There's a safe house," he whispered. "South side of the city. Abandoned warehouse near the docks." Monroe's stomach twisted. That was it. That was where Damien had gone. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the room. Harrison met him in the hallway. "Got something?" Monroe nodded. "Let's go hunting." They drove fast, sirens off, lights dimmed. Monroe's gun sat heavy in his holster, his mind locked on what was coming. Damien wasn't running. He was waiting. And this time, Monroe would make damn sure he didn't escape again. They reached the docks within an hour. The warehouse loomed in the darkness, its windows shattered, the metal doors rusted. Harrison parked a block away, cutting the engine. "You sure about this?" Monroe stared at the building. "No." Then he opened the door and stepped out. They moved silently, carefully. The warehouse was too quiet. Monroe could feel it. They were being watched. Then, a floorboard creaked. Monroe spun, gun raised. A shadow lunged from the darkness. Monroe fired. Bang! The figure dropped. Then, more movement. Another attacker rushed at him from the side. Monroe barely dodged. The man swung a knife, missing Monroe's throat by inches. Before the attacker could strike again, Harrison shot him twice. The man collapsed. Monroe's chest heaved. They weren't alone. Then, a slow clap echoed through the warehouse. And a voice. Smooth. Amused. Deadly. "Well done, Judge." Monroe turned, and there he was. Damien Knox. Standing at the far end of the warehouse, completely calm. As if he had been expecting this. He smiled. "I was starting to think you wouldn't come." Monroe raised his gun. Damien didn't flinch. "I wouldn't do that," he said. "Not unless you want to see what happens next." Monroe's eyes flickered. What was he talking about? Then, Damien stepped aside, and Monroe's blood turned to ice. A woman sat tied to a chair, her face bruised, her wrists bound, and Monroe knew exactly who she was. His sister. Damien smiled wider. "Now, Judge," he said softly, "let's talk." Judge Harold Monroe's blood ran cold. His sister, Rachel Monroe, sat tied to a chair, her face bruised, her arms bound behind her back. A strip of duct tape covered her mouth, but her eyes, wide with terror, spoke louder than any scream ever could. Damian Knox stood beside her, smirking. His blue eyes gleamed with satisfaction, the same twisted amusement he had worn during his trial. "Lower the gun, Judge," Damian said smoothly, tilting his head. "Unless you're willing to watch me carve up your own flesh and blood." Monroe's hands shook with rage. His finger itched to pull the trigger, to end this nightmare once and for all. But Rachel, Damian was a monster, but he wasn't bluffing. Monroe had seen what he was capable of. He had sentenced him for it. Slowly, Monroe exhaled and lowered his weapon. Harrison, standing beside him, whispered, "We can take him." Monroe barely shook his head. "Not like this. Not with Rachel's life on the line." "Good choice," Damian said, grinning. "You always were the smart one, weren't you?" He took a slow step forward. "But let's be honest, Monroe. You should have seen this coming. You humiliated me. You thought you could lock me away and walk away untouched." His eyes darkened. "But that's not how this works." Monroe's fist clenched. His heart hammered in his chest. "Let her go, Damian." Damian let out a cold, mocking laugh. "Why would I do that?" he said. "She's the only thing keeping you from putting a bullet between my eyes." Monroe's teeth gritted. Every muscle in his body screamed to move, to act, to fight. But if he did, Rachel would die before he could reach her. "Let's make a deal," Damian continued, stepping behind Rachel and resting a hand on her shoulder like she was property. Monroe saw red. "You listen to what I have to say," Damian continued. "And in return, maybe, just maybe, I let her walk out of here alive." Monroe exchanged a brief glance with Harrison. They had no choice. "Talk," Monroe spat. Damian's smirk widened. "Here's the thing, Judge. I could have killed you already. Easily." His voice was almost casual, like they were discussing the weather. "I could have had my men slit your throat while you slept. I could have left your body in a dumpster, unrecognizable." Rachel let out a muffled sob. "But I didn't," Damian continued. "Do you know why?" Monroe didn't answer. Damian's smile vanished. "Because I want you to suffer." Monroe's breath came faster now, his rage barely contained. "You took everything from me," Damian growled. "You took my empire, my money, my freedom. You made sure I was buried so deep I would never see the sun again." His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with unfiltered hatred. "So now, I'm going to take everything from you." Monroe's fist clenched. "You already failed." Damian arched an eyebrow. "You wanted me afraid, running. You wanted me to beg. But here I am. And the only person afraid in this room is you." Something flickered in Damian's expression. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Then, just as quickly, the smirk returned. "You always did love giving speeches, Judge." Damian sighed dramatically. "But let's not waste time." He pulled a knife from his jacket, long, sharp, gleaming. Rachel whimpered, her entire body trembling. Monroe moved before he could stop himself, but Damian was faster. He pressed the blade to her throat. "One more step," Damian whispered, "and she bleeds." Monroe froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. Damian chuckled. "See? That's better." Monroe's breath shuddered. Every inch of him wanted to lunge forward, to rip that knife from Damian's hands, and end this once and for all. But Rachel's life hung in the balance. Damian took his time, enjoying the power he held. "Here's how this is going to go," he said. "You're going to resign. You're going to disappear. And you're going to watch from the sidelines as I take back everything you stole from me." Monroe's eyes narrowed. "And if I refuse?" Damian's smile turned vicious. "Then I start cutting pieces off your sister until there's nothing left." Rachel's muffled scream filled the room. Monroe felt his pulse explode. Every instinct screamed at him to do something. Then, a single, sharp whistle cut through the air. It came from the shadows, and everything changed. In that instant, gunfire erupted. Bang, bang. One of Damian's men collapsed, a bullet between his eyes. Another was hit in the chest, dropping instantly. Rachel flinched. Damian spun around, startled. Monroe moved. Fast. Before Damian could react, Monroe lunged, grabbing his wrist and twisting the knife away from Rachel's throat. Damian snarled in rage. But Monroe drove a fist into his gut, knocking him back. Rachel fell forward, sobbing. Monroe didn't stop. He grabbed Damien by the collar and slammed him into the wall. "You think you can control me?" Monroe growled. Damien laughed. Even through the pain, even as blood dripped from his lip. "You still don't get it, do you?" he rasped. Monroe's grip tightened. Damien smirked. "You think this is over?" he whispered. "I've already won." Then, boom. A massive explosion rocked the warehouse. The walls shook. Fire burst from the windows. Monroe turned, his eyes landing on the entrance. The entire warehouse was rigged. Damien let out a weak chuckle. "Tick-tock, Judge," he murmured. Monroe's eyes widened. If they didn't get out now, the entire building was going to collapse. The explosion ripped through the warehouse, sending a shockwave that nearly knocked Judge Harold Monroe off his feet. Flames burst from the walls, the heat searing against his skin. His ears rang. His vision blurred. Through the smoke and chaos, he heard Rachel screaming. Monroe snapped back to reality. Rachel was still tied to the chair. The fire was closing in fast. No time. Monroe turned back to Damien Knox, but he was already moving. Damien's smirk was gone, replaced with focused determination. He kicked Monroe back, knocking him off balance. Then, in a swift motion, he bolted toward the nearest exit. "No!" Monroe roared, lunging after him. But a second explosion blasted through the far wall. Boom! Metal beams collapsed, blocking the doorway, separating them. Monroe coughed, shielding his face from the smoke. Damien was gone. Again. But he couldn't focus on that now. Rachel. He spun around, ignoring the burning in his lungs. Rachel was struggling against the ropes, her muffled cries desperate. "I got you," Monroe choked out. He reached for his pocket knife, slicing through the bindings. Rachel gasped as the ropes loosened, but Monroe didn't wait. He grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "We have to move now." The fire was everywhere, devouring the wooden beams, licking at the walls. The roof groaned. It was about to collapse. Monroe turned and nearly ran straight into Harrison. "Go!" the detective shouted. "The whole place is rigged." Monroe nodded, gripping Rachel's wrist. They ran. The flames chased them through the collapsing warehouse. Smoke swallowed the air, making it almost impossible to see. The front door was blocked. The windows were too high. Then Monroe saw it. A side exit, half broken, barely hanging on its hinges. It was their only chance. "Rachel, go!" he ordered, pushing her toward it. She hesitated for only a second, then scrambled through. Harrison followed, coughing, his face streaked with soot. Monroe turned for one last look and saw the roof begin to cave in. No time. He leaped forward, diving through the exit. Just as the warehouse collapsed behind him, the explosion erupted outward, sending a blast of heat across the dockyard. Monroe hit the pavement hard, rolling to a stop. Silence. For a moment, all he could hear was the crackling of fire. Then, Rachel's soft sobs. Monroe pushed himself up, his entire body aching. He turned to his sister, who was sitting on the ground, shaking, her wrists still red from the bindings. He pulled her into a hug. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're safe." Rachel clung to him, crying. For the first time in his life, Monroe felt completely powerless. Damien had won this round, but he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. An hour later, Monroe sat on the back of an ambulance. Rachel was inside, getting checked by paramedics. Harrison stood next to him, arms crossed, his expression grim. "He planned this from the beginning," Harrison muttered. Monroe nodded. The warehouse. The escape. The message. Harrison exhaled sharply. "We lost him again." Monroe clenched his fists. Not for long. Then, his phone buzzed. A blocked number. Monroe's stomach twisted. He answered. A moment of silence. Then, that voice. "Damien. Still alive, Judge?" Monroe's grip tightened around the phone. "Where are you?" Damien chuckled. Now. That would ruin the fun, wouldn't it?" Monroe gritted his teeth. "This ends soon, Damien." Another low laugh. "Oh, I know," Damien murmured. "And that's the best part." Then, click. The call ended. Monroe stared at the screen. Damien was out there. Somewhere. And he was planning something bigger. Monroe's pulse pounded. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone he loved. And he had to stop Damien before it was too late. The days following Damien Knox's escape were a blur of interviews, briefings, and frantic planning. Judge Harold Monroe couldn't focus. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rachel's face, terrified and bruised. He saw the fire consuming the warehouse, the smoke clouding his vision, the sound of Damien's mocking laughter ringing in his ears. But most of all, he saw the future Damien was building for him. Monroe knew the rules now. There were no more games, no more waiting. He couldn't run, he couldn't hide, and he couldn't waste another second. Monroe sat at his desk, papers spread out in front of him. The weight of the city's broken system was heavy on his shoulders. This wasn't just about his sister anymore. It was about stopping a man who had already proven he would tear apart everything Monroe held dear. And he would keep coming until there was nothing left. He took a deep breath and picked up the phone. "Detective Harrison, it's time," Monroe said, his voice steady. Harrison's voice crackled on the other end. "I'm ready. What's the plan?" "We find every ally Damien has left. Every contact, every cop, every politician. We track down every lead we have. Are you sure you want to do this, Judge?" Harrison asked, his voice soft. "This is going to get ugly." Monroe closed his eyes. "It already has." He stood up and paced the room, his mind racing. He had a list of names, all of them people who had helped Damien from the shadows, people he hadn't yet gotten to. But this time, he wasn't going to wait for Damien to strike first. He was going to be the one doing the hunting. The first place to start was Catherine Reed, a state senator whose ties to Damien were deeper than anyone had realized. Monroe knew that if he could connect her to the string of bribes and illegal activities Damien had orchestrated, they might just have enough to send him back to prison, for good. Monroe met Harrison outside the senator's office. The building was sleek and modern, but something about it felt off, too pristine, too cold. "I'll get the information we need," Monroe said. "You stay in contact. I don't want to take any chances." "Got it." Monroe nodded and walked into the building, his footsteps echoing in the grand marble lobby. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. His eyes narrowed. The sting operation wasn't going to be easy. It was going to take all of Monroe's skill and the cooperation of every cop still loyal to the law to bring down Catherine Reed. The elevator doors opened. Monroe stepped out onto the floor and walked toward Reed's office. He had to act fast. The senator had been in the game far too long, and Monroe knew that the deeper he went, the more dangerous it would get. But nothing was going to stop him. He couldn't let Damien win. Inside Reed's office, he found the evidence he needed: files, documents, and a hidden laptop with a trove of emails linking Reed to money transfers and illegal transactions. He snapped a few photos of the evidence and made a mental note to take them to the precinct. This was going to bring down the entire network, and with it, the people who had been helping Damien escape the law for so long. Monroe felt a momentary rush of triumph, but it was short-lived. The door opened. Reed walked in, her heels clicking on the marble floor, but she froze the moment she saw Monroe. "Judge Monroe," she said, her voice cold. "I didn't expect you here." Monroe turned to face her, the weight of her role in this whole mess hitting him like a punch in the gut. "You're about to have a very long day, Senator," he said quietly, his eyes steely. "I've got everything I need." Reed narrowed her eyes, but Monroe could see the flicker of panic behind them. "You think you can take me down with a few pictures? You're wrong. You don't know what you're messing with." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm messing with," Monroe replied. "And the fact is, you've been working for him all this time. You helped him escape. You've been feeding him information. And now, I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Reed stepped back, her face drained of color. "You won't get away with this." "Watch me," Monroe said, before turning and walking out. By the time Monroe and Harrison returned to the precinct, word had spread. The senator's name was everywhere, and the evidence was undeniable. The network of corrupt officials and criminals that had kept Damien free was finally being exposed. Monroe felt a small sense of relief, the first real one in weeks. But there was no time to savor the victory. Monroe knew Damien wasn't far behind. Damien always had one more move. Monroe looked at Harrison. We need to bring him in. Now. Harrison nodded. You'll get him, Judge. I'm sure of it. Monroe didn't respond. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the screen, staring at Damien's last known location. It wasn't much, but it was something. This time, there would be no more escapes. Monroe wasn't just going to catch Damien. He was going to make sure he never saw the light of day again. And then, finally, he could bring his sister home. The end.